This is the second of two lectures on the foundations of behavioral welfare economics. In the first lecture, we covered three topics. We began by asking, what is welfare? What are we trying to measure? I then described the behavioral critique of standard welfare economics and followed that with a discussion of the method known as behavioral revealed preference. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion by discussing a more general framework for behavioral welfare economics, and I'll also describe methods for empirical implementation. We've seen that there are some pretty serious problems with behavioral revealed preferences. So how do we find a path forward? Well, one approach is first to go backward. Let's return to the foundations, revisit our premises, think about how to revise those premises in light of a defensible view of how consumers operate, and then reason from those revised premises to a new framework. On this slide, I have reproduced the three premises that provide the foundation for standard welfare economics. And the question before us is, how should we reformulate these premises in light of both the implementation critique and the coherence critique? For behavioral revealed preference, we're only taking the implementation critique seriously. Here, we want to take both of them seriously. To reason out a path forward, I'm going to distinguish between what I call direct judgments and indirect judgments. Direct judgments are judgments that pertain to outcomes we care about for their own sake. Indirect judgments pertain to alternatives that lead to those outcomes. So, to take an example, my direct judgments may pertain to my mental states. I like some mental states better than others. My indirect judgments may pertain to consumption goods that influence those states. Now, my argument is that neither behavioral critique, neither the implementation critique nor the coherence critique, impugns direct judgments, or by implication, correctly understood indirect judgments. Claims that direct judgments are flawed either are veiled implementation critiques or are just expressions of differences of opinion between the analyst and the consumer. Claims that there's some variation in a person's direct judgments by context doesn't address the basis for deferring to the individual. If you had a panel of experts on a topic, and those experts gave somewhat different recommendations about what to do in a given circumstance, you wouldn't say, well, it's all nonsense, or at least you probably shouldn't say it's all nonsense. You would probably look for the consistent elements of their recommendations and defer to those. So the mere fact that someone will exercise somewhat different judgment in different contexts doesn't mean that those judgments are invalid or that they don't merit deference. So I would propose that we proceed based on two modified premises. Well, I'll call them premise A and premise B. Premise A says that with respect to matters involving either direct judgment or correctly understood indirect judgment, each of us is the best arbiter of our own well-being. This is a relaxed form of premise one. And premise B says that when we choose, we seek to benefit ourselves by selecting the alternative that, in our judgment, is most conducive to our well-being. And that's it. We have no premise here concerning the existence of preferences or that preferences are well-behaved. Now, one question that you might well ask is, if there's no such thing as true preferences, then why limit consideration to constructed judgments that involve choice? There are other kinds of constructed judgments we could look to, like stated preferences. Why aren't stated preferences just as good a basis for creating a welfare framework as choice? Well, I would answer that question as follows. The purpose of the judgment should be conformable with the purpose of the analysis. So normative economic analysis is usually intended to guide policymakers when they select among alternatives with the object of promoting the well-being of those affected by the selection. And when somebody makes a choice, arguably they're doing the same thing. So the objectives are conformable. When somebody states a preference, that's not their objective. Their objective is to answer a question. And that objective is not conformable with the objective of normative analysis. And that lack of conformance can lead to problems. We actually don't know what objective people are pursuing when they state their preferences. To implement these premises in a welfare framework, we'll have to grapple with two issues. The first is, how are we going to distinguish between choices that reflect correctly and incorrectly understood judgments? And the second is, how will we accommodate inconsistencies among the judgments that we decide merit deference? Remember that under the coherence critique, we have to accept that such inconsistencies will inevitably exist. Now we're ready to use these premises to build a general framework for behavioral welfare economics. Let me begin with the overall structure of the framework. Analysis will proceed in 3 steps. Step 0 involves identifying the scope of the consumer's concerns. Step 1 involves identifying all the decisions that merit deference. I will call this the welfare relevant domain and often abbreviate it as WRD. Step 3 will involve constructing a welfare criterion based at least in part on the properties of choice within that domain. And then having completed those steps, one can use that welfare criterion to evaluate welfare in applied situations. This framework is based on my work with Antonio Rangel, which I have continued to develop in subsequent work. And one of these years we'll manage to finish a book that I'm writing on the subject. Now, it's important to realize that going through these 3 steps is essentially what we do in the various versions of behavioral revealed preference, except in that context, we require consistency of choices, either overall or within designated subsets after step 1, so that we can recover what some economists call true preferences in step 2. The key to this general framework is that we will devise a welfare criterion for step 2 that accommodates inconsistencies among the choices that merit deference. And then in step 0 and step 1, we are no longer required to arrive at a welfare relevant domain within which all choices are consistent. And because we don't face that requirement anymore, we are then free to devise objective evidence-based principles for steps 0 and 1, and accept that those principles may leave us with inconsistencies. We don't face the problem that we did with behavioral revealed preference, where if an objective approach leaves us with inconsistencies in a particular application, we go back to the drawing board and revisit our supposedly objective principles. We don't have to do that here if we can live with the inconsistencies, if some of them remain. This approach also has the advantage of providing us with the ability to conduct welfare analysis under multiple alternative assumptions about the welfare relevant domain. We don't have to just adopt one view. So here, once again, are the 3 steps involved in this general approach. And I've highlighted steps 1 and 2 because for step 0, there's really nothing new here. Identifying the scope of the consumer's concerns is part of what we have to do for all choice-based economics, whether it's positive or normative. We have to identify the scope of the consumer's concerns. So our focus here will be on step 1, identifying all decisions that merit deference, that is defining the welfare relevant domain. And step two, constructing a welfare criterion based on the properties of choice within that domain. I'm going to start here with step two, the welfare criterion. The reason is that if we can come up with a welfare criterion that accommodates inconsistent choices in the welfare relevant domain, then we can be reassured that we are free to develop objective evidence-based methods for steps 0 and 1 without worrying that we're going to be left with a set of choices that we can't do anything with because they're not consistent. So resolving the issue for step 2 is what makes everything work. Where do we begin? Well, let's begin with the notion of a welfare criterion. A welfare criterion is a binary relation. Here I'll write it as W for welfare. And when we write X, W, Y, that just means that outcome X is better than outcome Y according to this welfare relation. Now, the question that we want to pose is, what requirements would we want W to satisfy as a welfare relation? What's the minimal list of requirements it should satisfy? I've listed 3 requirements here, and I don't think they're actually very controversial. The first property is what I'll call coherence. And coherence is that W, the welfare relation, is acyclic. Acyclicity is weaker than transitivity. It's the minimal condition that we need to ensure the existence of a maximal element within a finite set. To be clear, I am not saying that the individual's choices are acyclic. They may cycle. We're not ruling anything out when it comes to individual choice. What we're saying here is that as we search for welfare criteria, we will look for acyclic relationships because otherwise we can't make any coherent statements about welfare. The second property is what I call responsiveness to choice. And it is the following. If within the welfare relevant domain, the option Y is never chosen when the option X is available, no matter what the choice set is, no matter what the frame is, then we will say that X is better than Y in terms of this welfare relation. The third property involves consistency with the definition of the welfare relevant domain. And it says that if X is chosen in some decision problem with opportunity set capital X within the welfare relevant domain, then X is not improvable within that set according to W, the welfare relation. Well, why do I say that? If little x is improvable within this choice set capital X, then it is a mistake. But in step 1, where we identified the welfare relevant domain, we deleted all of the choices that we could identify as mistaken. We've taken them out of the welfare relevant domain. And we don't have any information available to us in step 2 that was unavailable in step 1. And therefore, if we could declare something a mistake in step 2, we should have declared it as a mistake in step 1 and removed it from the welfare relevant domain. So to the extent it remains in the welfare relevant domain, it is not a mistake. And our welfare relation shouldn't declare that it's a mistake. So now we have 3 properties. They're basically axioms. And we want to know what welfare relations satisfy those axioms. Well, here's a natural candidate. The candidate is called the unambiguous choice relation. And I will use the symbol P star to denote this particular candidate for W. Here we will say that X is P star to Y, if and only if the welfare relevant domain contains no decision problem in which X is available, but the consumer is willing to choose Y. So Y is never chosen when X is available. Now, there will be some decision problems where only X and Y are available, and consequently, in those settings, this is also saying that the individual will choose X over Y. The definition of P star sounds very similar to the definition of the revealed preference relation. However, you'll notice that when there are choice inconsistencies, P star will be an incomplete relation. In particular, it may be that we have neither xp star y or yp star x. Now, given our axioms, we have a simple characterization theorem, and it is that p star satisfies properties 1 through 3, and moreover, it is the unique binary relation satisfying these 3 properties. The implication of this theorem is that if you accept the 3 requirements that I listed on the previous slide, then P star is the only game in town. We need to build our framework for welfare analytics around P star. We don't really have any other choices. Now, there may be cases where this criterion, P star, isn't sufficiently discerning to make welfare analysis useful. And in that case, deeper step 0 and step 1 analysis may turn out to be fruitful. But this framework doesn't require that you go back to step 0 and step 1 and make adjustments so that the welfare relevant domain ends up being internally consistent. An interesting feature of P star is that it yields an acyclic welfare relation, even when underlying choices are cyclic. And that's sort of a magical property. So let's take a look at an example and see how that works. Here I list 4 opportunity sets, which I label G1, G2, G3, and G4. G1 includes X and Y. We assume X is chosen. G2 includes Y and X. We assume Y is chosen. G3 includes Z and X, and we assume Z is chosen. So here you have a cyclic relation. And what do we do with that? Well, we remember that there's one other choice set, G4, where X, Y, and Z are all available. And we have to make some assumption about what the individual will choose from that set. So let's just imagine that they choose X from this set. In that case, let's figure out what P star implies. First of all, we have XP star Y because both are available in G1 and G4. X is chosen in both cases, Y is chosen in neither. We also have YP star Z because Y and Z are available in G2 and G4, and Z is chosen in neither of those situations. How about X and Z? Well, X and Z are available in G3, where Z is chosen, and G4, where X is chosen. So P star does not rank X and Z, and that's the sense in which it's incomplete. Now, does that incompleteness stop us from talking about welfare optima? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. What's the welfare optimum within the set G1? Well, in G1, we have X and Y available, and X is P star to Y, so you can improve Y, so X is best. In G2, Y and Z are available, and Y is P star to Z, so you can improve Z. Y is the best choice. In G3, X and Z are available, and they're unranked, so you can't improve on either of them. So either one is a best choice. Finally, in G4, where X, Y, and Z are available, well, you can improve on Y by moving to X, and you can improve on Z by moving to Y because Y is P star to X. So Y and Z are both improvable in this set. X is not, and therefore X is the maximal element in G4 of the welfare order. So you see here that intransitivities may be a problem for positive analysis. If you had the data on choices from sets G1, G2, and G3, and somebody asked you, what will this person pick in G4? You'd probably go, I have no idea. But once the positive economist does his or her job and figures out what goes on in G4, the normative economist can step in and say, well, I know what to do with that, and I can generate an acyclic welfare relation regardless of what that choice is. Now, a lot of this may seem rather abstract. I'm talking about binary relations, I'm talking about acyclicity, and so forth. It's important to understand that the application of these methods is intuitively straightforward. So let me give an example where, depending on framing, Norman always chooses a mug over $4 and always chooses $5 over a mug, but his decision is frame dependent if the price is between $4 and $5. In that case, using this method, the unambiguous choice criterion, what we would say is that the equivalent variation associated with having the mug is no less than $4 and no greater than $5. We would have a range. And the range would reflect the normative ambiguity implied by Norman's conflicting choices. So all of the analytic tools of standard welfare economics extend naturally to this setting. You can talk about equivalent variation, compensating variation, consumer surplus, Pareto optimality, and so forth. Let me quickly run through an illustration. Let's suppose there are two goods, Y and Z, and let's treat Y as the numeraire. We'll use M to denote income and P to denote the price of the good Z. Well, let's imagine that the demand for good Z depends on a demand framing variable, which we'll write as D. People don't care about this demand framing variable directly. For example, it may just be a psychological anchor. Higher D will imply greater demand for good Z. And I've cited this paper by Ariely, Lowenstein, and Prelec here on coherent arbitrariness because it has exactly this structure. Now let's suppose that a policy changes the price and the decision frame from the pair P0 and D0 to the pair P1 and D1, and that this causes the demand for the good Z to fall. We're going to evaluate the welfare effects of that change. And to do that, I will specialize to the quasi-linear case. In other words, a case in which we have no income effects. Decision utility U, which is a function of the bundle Y and Z, is conditioned on D, the framing variable, and it's just equal to Y plus D times V of Z. And this framing variable D ranges between some lower bound of DL and upper bound of DH. Let's focus on equivalent variation. The analysis is completely analogous for compensating variation. So you could imagine defining equivalent variation in two different ways. I'll define EVA as the smallest increment to income with the initial pair, P0, D0, such that the bundle obtained with P0, D0 is unambiguously chosen in the sense of P star over the one obtained with P1, D1. Then we have a second definition, which I'll call EVB. This is the largest increment to income with P0, D0, such that the bundle obtained with P1, D1 is unambiguously chosen in the sense of P star over the one obtained with P0, D0. So in the first instance, we are considering the smallest increment to income such that the initial bundle is unambiguously chosen over the final bundle. And in the second instance, we're considering the largest increment to income such that the final bundle is unambiguously chosen over the initial bundle. It's always the case that EVA is weakly greater than EVB, and moreover, they coincide when the choice mapping is consistent in the sense of warp. These concepts are useful because we can say that the policy change is unambiguously worth at least EVB and worth no more than EVA. Now, when there are no income effects, as we've assumed, equivalent variation and compensating variation, as we have defined these concepts, can be captured by standard demand curves completely analogously to Marshallian consumer surplus. This slide illustrates the calculation of EVA and EVB. We have EVA over on the left-hand side and EVB over on the right-hand side. And what we're doing here is examining a shift from the pair P0, D0 to P1, D1. So at the initial price P0 and at the initial framing variable D0, the individual consumes the amount Z0. Z0 is just on the demand curve that prevails when the framing variable is D0. Now, when the price changes to P1 and the framing variable changes to little d1, the demand curve shifts upwards to this curve. And at this price, P1, the individual purchases Z1. Now, to calculate EVA, we determine the area of the two shaded regions and add them up. The first shaded region, labeled A, is simply the quantity Z1 times the price differential. The second one, labeled B, is just the area underneath the highest demand curve and above the lowest price. And we add those two together. For EVB, we do exactly the same thing, except instead of using the highest value of the framing variable, DH, we use the lowest value, DL. That leads to a lower demand curve. And then when we take the vertical difference between this low demand curve and a horizontal line at P naught, we get a positive region, which I've labeled C, and a negative region, which I have labeled E. So if we sum A plus C minus E, we'll get EVB. This is just an illustration. The point that I want you to take away from the illustration is that it's possible to do familiar types of economic analysis using counterparts to familiar tools when you implement this framework. You don't have to be working with binary relations and so forth. Everything translates into these sorts of tools analogously to the way it does in standard theory. Now that we've confirmed that there is a coherent way to accommodate inconsistencies in choices within the welfare relevant domain, once we get to step 2, we can handle those situations. Let's go back to step 1 and ask, what objective principles do we want to use to identify the welfare relevant domain? I want you to remember that it is essential to avoid the circularity trap. And that requires us to exclude choices from the welfare relevant domain based on criteria that do not reference preferences or objectives. As soon as we reference preferences or objectives, this is going to be circular. So we have to keep those out of the picture entirely. Let's go back to the foundations again. The foundations tell us that a choice does not merit deference if and only if it's based on an incorrectly understood indirect judgment. And that phenomenon I call characterization failure. The reason is that it means that the individual is characterizing their opportunities incorrectly. Second, a choice doesn't merit deference if it differs from a choice in an equivalent decision problem that's based on a direct or correctly understood indirect judgment. In other words, if there is context dependence. And the reason the second criterion is here is that someone can make the right choice for the wrong reason. Now, when a choice satisfies these two properties, we classify it as a mistake. There is characterization failure, and the choice differs from a choice that is made in a setting in which there is no identifiable characterization failure. Then we say that this choice is a mistake. With that foundational perspective in mind, we arrive at what I might call a gold standard for refining the welfare relevant domain. First, we need to demonstrate that behavior is context dependent. If somebody sticks to their guns despite understanding the consequences, if they make a choice and you say, well, you probably misunderstood the following, and they say, no, I got it. I really want to do this. And you say, but did you realize the following? And they say, yeah, it's okay. I got it. I want to do this. And you say, but what about this? And they say, well, I didn't realize that, but that doesn't really make any difference. I'm happy with what I've chosen. If they stick to their guns no matter what, then there's actually no basis for saying that the judgments that they're exercising are wrong. And the second piece is that we need to demonstrate characterization failure. We need to show that context dependence, where it occurs, results from differences in comprehension of the decision problem and not just from contextually constructed judgments. How do we do that? Well, we can evaluate whether people properly understand concepts and or facts that are central to proper characterization of the pertinent choice problems. And we can also examine evidence concerning the processes of observation and attention, memory, forecasting, and learning to determine when facts are ignored or processed incorrectly. To drive these ideas home, let me give a simple illustration. And this is from my 2004 paper on addiction with Antonio. American visitors to the United Kingdom suffer numerous injuries and fatalities because they often look only to the left before stepping into streets, even though they know traffic approaches from the right. One cannot reasonably attribute this to the pleasure of looking left or to masochistic preferences. The pedestrian's objectives to cross the street safely are clear, and the decision is plainly a mistake. And I would add that optimal policy in this setting is also obvious. If you see someone stepping in front of a bus, you reach out, grab him, and pull him back. I will guarantee that he will not say to you, how dare you abrogate my right to express my preferences through my choices. So in this context, is there a basis for declaring that the consumer suffers from characterization failure? Well, one could easily gather evidence that would convince us that there is characterization failure. The individual may make statements indicating that they stepped in front of the bus because they were inattentive. We may also be able to gather evidence of reliance on habituated semi-automatic responses, which may have kicked in when this individual found themselves in a city where cars come from the other direction. What about context dependence? Well, here we can rely on observations of how people behave when they actually do look both ways, and we know they have the relevant information. Now let me consider a more serious application, one that involves biased beliefs. Let's return to the Kosegi-Rabin coin flip problem. The idea is that we're going to flip a coin over and over again, and before each flip, we can elicit two certainty equivalents, one for a claim that pays $1 if the flip is heads, the other for a claim that pays $1 if the flip is tails. And we notice that after a string of heads, Norman's certainty equivalent for the tails claim is higher than his certainty equivalent for the heads claim, presumably because he thinks tails is due. Now you'll notice that this behavior can be reinterpreted as reflecting context dependence and characterization failure. With respect to context dependence, let's make an irrelevant change in the setting by changing the labels on the two sides of the coin each time it's flipped. So at first it's heads and tails, next it's cats and dogs, next it's up and down, and so forth. Now in that setting, the individual round after round will probably be willing to pay exactly the same amount for each of the two claims. And yet we know that this problem is objectively equivalent to the original problem. Therefore, this is just a change in framing, and consequently, it shows context dependence. How about characterization failure? Well, here, it's probably relatively easy to demonstrate a poor comprehension of conditional probability just by testing that comprehension directly. This all may seem a little bit roundabout. Isn't it just obvious that the individual is making an error in this case? Well, yes, that's right. The advantage of explicitly noting that we can describe this context as one involving context dependence and characterization failure is that that interpretation extends to settings with subjective probabilities, whereas the simple divergence from objective probabilities does not generalize. With respect to context dependence, we can always assess whether the choice is sensitive to more transparent presentations of the same objective information. And with respect to characterization failure, we can administer tests to shed light on comprehension of facts and governing principles. to see whether the individual actually understands their opportunities. Now, even though we aren't requiring step one to deliver a welfare relevant domain within which choices are completely consistent in the sense of warp, you may well wonder, what if it turns out that after we apply our objective criteria in step one, we obtain a welfare relevant domain that's just right in the sense that it's both comprehensive and internally consistent rather than too large. In other words, a set that still contains inconsistencies. Well, in that case, it turns out that P star, the unambiguous choice relation, specializes to the standard revealed preference relation. And we thereby arrive at the third interpretation of V, the normative objective function that's used in behavioral revealed preference that I gave previously. It's just a function that rationalizes choices. In other words, it is decision utility, but within a special set of decision frames. And consequently, this framework, the one that I've described, provides a true generalization of the behavioral revealed preference approach. It is, in essence, telling you how to do behavioral revealed preference without the second welfare premise. In other words, while acknowledging the validity of the coherence criterion. And one reason that I'm emphasizing this is that Chetty's Eli lecture actually has this point wrong. He sees these as competing approaches rather than as nested approaches. Seeing behavioral revealed preference exercises through the lens of the Bernheim-Rangel framework is useful because it highlights the fact that welfare analysis hinges on choice mappings and on the properties of choice mappings rather than on the cognitive models that we use to rationalize those mappings. And consequently, it resonates with the sufficient statistic approach widely used in much of public economics. What we're looking at is basic information about behavior, and we're basing our welfare judgments directly on that behavior. I want to say a final quick word or two about social aggregation. Everything that I've said so far is about the evaluation of individual welfare. And of course, in many situations, we're concerned with social welfare. There are tools for aggregation that we use in standard economics. And on this slide, I'm just explaining that those tools extend to this framework. So for example, you can define a generalized Pareto criterion. We do that in our 2009 paper. We say that an allocation X is a weak generalized Pareto optimum in some set capital X, if and only if there exists no alternative little y in that set, with y unambiguously preferred to X for all I. And one can use this criterion to prove theorems about general equilibrium. For example, one can show that a generalized competitive equilibrium defined as a vector of prices and frames that balance supply and demand in all market is a weak generalized Pareto optimum. So the first theorem of welfare economics generalizes. In some of my other work, I've also demonstrated that there are formal justifications for using aggregate equivalent and compensating variation. So for example, adding equivalent variations up over the individual consumers. There's also a literature in standard economics that deals with the derivation of interpersonally comparable scales. And there's a paper by Fleurbet and Schockert that shows how those methods can be extended to this setting. So social aggregation pretty much proceeds in the same way as with the standard welfare framework. My final topic concerns empirical methods. How do we take this framework to the data? And in particular, how have people taken it to the data? I'm going to start by focusing on what I'll call the core methods for implementing this welfare framework. And these core empirical methods consist of executing three tasks. I've listed them here. Task 0 is to justify the assumptions about the scope of the consumer's concerns. Task 1 is to justify the assumptions concerning the boundaries of the welfare relevant domain. And task 2 is to estimate the choice mappings, both within the naturally occurring domain and within the welfare relevant domain, so that we can actually derive the welfare criterion and apply it to the choices of interest. Now, I don't have much to say about task 0. As I mentioned earlier, this is underdeveloped. There are certain things that we can do here, like asking people what they care about, but we don't really have a collection of methods to address this in a more systematic way. I'm going to focus on the other two tasks. So let me turn to task 1, which is how do we justify assumptions concerning the boundaries of the welfare relevant domain? The following is a list of principles that we can invoke when we are trying to justify our assumptions about the boundaries of the welfare relevant domain, what decisions merit deference and which ones don't. The first principle that we can invoke concerns transparency versus opaqueness. We can ask, are the options and consequences stated directly, or do they require inference? And if the inference is required, is it complex or is it subtle? Everything else equal, if one setting states an important fact directly and another setting requires the decision maker to deduce that fact, the first one is less likely to induce characterization failure than the second. The second principle that we can invoke involves comprehension. We can ask whether people actually understand the principles required to infer the opaquely stated options and consequences. We can ask whether people are invoking the principles and deploying the information required to infer opaquely stated options and consequences. And we can ask whether people are making correct inferences. So I think of the first principle, transparency versus opaqueness, as basically creating a presumption for characterization failure. The characterization failure is more likely to occur when options and consequences are stated opaquely and less likely to occur when they're stated transparently. And I think of the second principle, comprehension, as diagnostic. We can use it to verify the presumption that we've created in the first step. At the bottom of this slide, I've listed several examples of papers that use these strategies. There's a paper that I've written with Sandro Ambule and Anna Maria Lusardi on financial competence, a tax salience paper by Chetty, Linney, and Croft, demand for energy efficient light bulbs by Alcott and Taubinski. There are actually many others, and they all try to use the same blueprint of distinguishing between relatively transparent and relatively opaque choices, and when the analysis is done well, verifying that the understanding was clearer and more accurate with the transparent choices. So just to take the example of financial competence, in my paper with Sandro and Anna, what we do is present people with decisions where they have to choose between money today and money later. And in these settings, we either tell them the amount that they receive now and the amount that they receive later. For example, we say you can have $10 now or $20 in 36 days. And then the alternative, more opaquely stated version of the same problem is we say, you can have $10 now, or you can have a $10 investment in an asset that returns 2% per day for 36 days, compounded daily. Now, those two options are essentially the same. One is transparent, the other is not. If you started with the opaquely stated version of this problem, someone would have to use that information to compute the information that they're given in the first problem. Consequently, it is far more plausible to say that they understand their options and consequences in the transparently stated version than in the opaquely stated version. Similarly, in that paper, we also verified directly that people don't understand compound interest. They get compounding wrong. And consequently, it makes sense that they would make a different choice when the problem is stated in an opaque way. They probably misunderstand the problem. These other papers have much the same structure, as do many others now that are in the literature. The third principle for justifying assumptions concerning the welfare relevant domain is that we can examine processes. So we can ask whether cognitive processes involving attention, memory, forecasting, and so forth are consistent with the ability to make correct inferences. And in a previous lecture, I've given an example of where this sort of principle has been used. In my own work with Antonio on the optimal taxation of addictive substances, we examined the neurobiology of addiction and argued based on the evidence that addictive substances cause a hardwired forecasting module in the brain to fail, to produce incorrect forecasts. And arguably, those incorrect forecasts amount to mischaracterization of consequences. Now let's turn to task 2, which requires us to estimate the choice mappings both within the naturally occurring domain and within the welfare relevant domain. We need to know what the choice mappings are. Estimating the choice mappings within the naturally occurring domain is completely standard. There's nothing new here. That's what we do in economics all the time. The new part of this task concerns estimating the choice mappings within the welfare relevant domain. This is non-standard because the welfare relevant domain is usually unobserved or only partially observed. Papers in this literature have employed one of 4 different methods to recover the choice mapping in the welfare relevant domain. The first method is to create and implement appropriately reframed decision problems. In other words, just to put people in the welfare relevant domain and see what they do. That's what Sandro and Anna and I do in our paper on financial competence. We actually give people the transparently framed choices. Chetty, Looney, and Croft do something similar in their tax salience paper. They give people information on sales taxes directly and estimate their demand under those conditions. And Alcott and Taubinski do something similar with respect to the demand for energy efficient light bulbs. The second method is to extrapolate the missing welfare relevant choices from other types of decisions using structural models. This is often done in the context of analyses that involve biased beliefs. In those cases, people are using structural models of choice, often expected utility, and substituting objective probabilities for subjective beliefs, exactly as I described a little while ago. So this approach has been used to evaluate biased beliefs concerning energy costs, concerning income taxes, and concerning reemployment probabilities in the context of optimal unemployment insurance. The same method has also been deployed in the context of exercises involving time inconsistency. There, the structural model might be the beta delta model. So people are recovering the beta parameter and the delta parameter, and based on their view of the welfare relevant domain, inferring what the choices would be. So one could observe naturally occurring choices without pre-commitment, but identify beta and infer what the welfare relevant choices would be. Gruber and Kosegi have done this with respect to consumption of addictive substances. O'Donoghue and Rabin adopt this approach with respect to the consumption of unhealthy foods. The third method involves extrapolating the missing welfare relevant choices from the decisions of similar individuals who ostensibly avoid characterization failure. This is sometimes known as the rational consumer benchmark. So as an example, there's this paper by Bronnenberg et al. That looks at choices between branded drugs and generic drugs. And the claim is that people are willing to pay too much for the branded drugs. They're chemically identical. The benchmark here that they use is doctors and pharmacists. So they look to the choices among branded and generic drugs by doctors and pharmacists. And then they suggest that that benchmark is appropriate for evaluating the decisions of people who lack expertise in this area. And in doing that, they also try to control for other differences between doctors, pharmacists, and the rest of the population. Alcott et al. Deploy a similar strategy to evaluate welfare in the context of the consumption of sugary drinks. And their rational consumer benchmark consists of people who are knowledgeable about nutrition and who have no self-assessed overconsumption and whose spouses also agree that they don't overconsume. Finally, the fourth method involves extrapolating the missing welfare relevant choices from non-choice data. And an example of this would be a paper by Stutzer and Frey, who evaluated the welfare costs of underweighting commuting time when choosing residential location. And they did that by evaluating ex post happiness and, in a sense, converting ex post happiness into dollars. So implicitly, this amounts to an inference of how much people would have been willing to pay to avoid a bad consequence if they had understood the consequence as they ultimately experienced it. So those are the core empirical methods. And now I want to briefly mention some additional methods that are sometimes deployed. One method involves the examination of dominated choices. The idea is to use the frequency of dominated choices as an index of the quality of decision-making. And there are a couple of variants of this. The first variant is to focus on tasks in which there are dominant options and ask whether people choose the dominant options. The second variant is to focus on tasks with dominated options, but non-degenerate efficient frontiers. So no dominant options, and to ask whether people avoid the dominated options. Now, it's important to be clear that this approach does not invoke a different notion of a mistake than the approach that I've already described. The relationship may not be completely obvious, but it's there. If we assume preferences are monotonic, then selection of a dominated action implies context dependence, because there must be some other frame in which the individual realizes what they're doing and chooses the undominated alternative. And moreover, the selection of a dominated option removes explanations other than characterization failure, because as long as monotonicity is satisfied, the individual would agree in every frame that they are better off with the dominant alternative. Now, notice that this allows us to determine the characterization failure is present without identifying the source of the failure. We don't have to know here why the problem occurred. So as some examples, there's a paper by Bhargava et al., which examines choices of healthcare plans in a large US firm and shows that the majority of those choices are actually dominated. There's also a paper by Choi, Leibson, and Madrian that documents a failure to make matched contributions to 401k plans near retirement. And because someone near retirement can make a contribution, get the match, and immediately withdraw their contribution without penalty, those failures involve dominated choices. Dominance approaches do have a number of important limitations. With respect to the first variant, which involves contexts where there are dominant options, first of all, choices with dominant options are rare. This approach can't be applied in many situations. In addition, it's not clear that the lessons generalize. The reason is that dominant options remove preferences from the mix. The optimal choice is the same for everyone, regardless of their preferences. And consequently, it basically reduces the decision to a math problem. Decision problems may be quite a bit more fragile when choice problems implicate preferences, because preferences bring motivated reasoning into the picture. We've studied that in another lecture. Without preferences in the picture, people may behave differently and may make different kinds of mistakes than when preferences are in the picture. Now, the second variant of the dominance method, which focuses on contexts with dominated options and non-degenerate efficient frontiers, does keep preferences in the mix. However, a reduction in the frequency of dominated choices does not go hand in hand with welfare improvements. You can move towards the frontier or even move all the way to the frontier from a point that is off the frontier and make the individual worse off. This isn't a crazy possibility. For example, it's quite likely that most investors hold inefficient portfolios. Now, we could move all of their portfolios to the efficient frontier, but which part of the frontier should we move them to? We can actually make them worse off by moving them to the wrong part of the frontier. So a reduction in the frequency of dominated choices is neither necessary nor sufficient for a welfare improvement. Another method involves the examination of consistency with revealed preference axioms. The idea here is to use the frequency of warp or GARP violations as an index of the quality of decision-making. Now, this too is not really a different notion of a mistake. If we assume people have preferences that satisfy these axioms, then these failures imply context dependence. It must be that there's another context where we could have induced people to express their actual preferences. And like the dominance method, it removes explanations other than characterization failure, because again, we're assuming that there is some underlying preference that satisfies the axiom. And again, there's no need to identify the source of the failure. So for an example of this approach, you can look at Choi, Kariv, Mueller, and Silverman, who examined the quality of financial choices in an experiment, quantifying the degree of GARP violations. This method also has a number of limitations. First of all, the validity of the method depends on the assumption that people actually have preferences satisfying the axiom being tested. And I've argued that we're really better off not imposing that assumption. Second, there's no way to tell which choices are faulty. If we see the individual having a lot of violations of the axioms, we know that the individual is making a mistake under the maintained hypothesis that the axiom is valid, but we can't tell whether one particular choice or another particular choice is causing the problem. And that severely limits the way we can use this type of evidence. The next problem is that decision-making errors do not necessarily give rise to warp or GARP violations. Let's say that Norman prefers oranges to bananas and bananas to apples, but consistently mistakes apples for oranges in naturally occurring frames. Well, in that case, he'll satisfy warp. He's making a mistake, but he's satisfying warp. A reduction in warp or GARP violations is therefore neither necessary nor sufficient for an improvement in the quality of decision-making. And again, that's a severe limitation of this alternative method. The final method that I want to mention concerns meta-choices. And the idea of a meta-choice is that we attempt to discover which of two decision frames leads to a better outcome when paired with the same menu by asking the consumer to choose between them. For an example of this approach, I've listed a paper by Della Vigna, List, and Malmendier, which examines the welfare cost of social pressure from charitable solicitations. This approach suffers from a general limitation, which is that meta-choices just involve presenting the same menu with new framing. They do not generally resolve the welfare question because the bias that infects either component decision may also infect the meta-choice. To illustrate, let's suppose that Norman makes bad decisions when an option is presented in a shiny wrapper. Well, then choosing between a decision problem where some options are presented in shiny wrappers and one where none are presented in shiny wrappers suffers from the same problem, because he may be attracted to the problem with the shiny wrappers. For a more serious example, consider the problem of evaluating welfare for an individual who's time inconsistent. She chooses A over B 4 time t at time t, but chooses A over B 4 time t at time t minus 1. Now, the only way to choose between those two decision problems is to have her choose at time t minus 2. Now, of course, her perspective at time t minus 2 agrees with her perspective at time t minus 1, so she'll choose to make the decision at t minus 1. But that doesn't mean that it's a better perspective. It simply means that at t minus 2, she has the same perspective. The other concern about meta choices is that they can introduce new biases. Let's suppose that Norman chooses between two decision tasks that require different skills. He may do very poorly if he has poor metacompetence. That is, if he doesn't properly understand the level of skill he possesses for performing each one of these tasks.